For a band that completely defined the 1970s and 1980s, there's one record in their catalog that didn't just miss the mark, it effectively stopped the entire machine dead in its tracks. So today we're looking at the ultimate momentum killer in rock history. We're talking about Van Halen III. We're going to break down the failed experiment that led to the longest, darkest silence in the band's history. When a massive rock band puts out a bad album, and most of them do at some point, what they usually do is what they've always done. They lick their wounds, they try and write better songs, they blame the producer, and then they go back into the studio a year later and they try to write a hit to make everyone forget about that flop. But that's not what happened after Van Halen III dropped in March of 1988. The aftermath of this album wasn't just a disappointed fan base or a drop in ticket sales. The aftermath was a total collapse. After this record, Van Halen, my favorite band and the biggest, most dominant American rock band of their era, they didn't release another full-length studio album of original material until 2012. So think about that. That's a 14-year silence. For well over a decade, there was no new Van Halen album, no triumphant return to form, just a massive gaping hole in the rock landscape. And this wasn't just a misstep, it was a career-stalling event. So to understand how an untouchable band crashes that hard, you have to look at the exact environment they were operating in during the mid-90s. So by 1996, the Van Halen camp was completely fractured. The decade-long run with Sammy Hagar, it had hit a brick wall. And the recording of the song Humans Being for the Twister soundtrack turned into a bitter, drawn-out fight. By that summer, Sammy was out. Now, the details of whether he quit or was fired, it really depends on who you ask, but the end result was the same. Van Halen needed a new singer. At this time, the band's manager was a guy named Ray Danniels, who was also the manager of Rush, and coincidentally, he also happened to be Alex Van Halen's brother-in-law. So Ray Danniels was managing the band's affairs, and all the decisions made during this window were nothing short of chaotic. I mean, first they brought David Lee Roth back, just long enough to record 2 new tracks for a greatest hits album, and do an incredibly awkward appearance at the MTV Music Awards. The fans, they thought a full reunion was happening. I mean, I was ecstatic, but then we found out shortly thereafter it wasn't. I mean, it blew up almost immediately. It left us fans of the band frustrated, and the band looked really unorganized. Then out of nowhere, Gary Cherone gets the job. I didn't have that one on my bingo card at all. And I want to be fair to Gary Cherone because I'm a fan of Extreme and I'm a fan of Gary Cherone. I mean, he's a phenomenal singer. His work with Extreme, I mean, it proves he's got vocal chops. And he's definitely not the villain in this story, but in the context of Van Halen in 1996, Gary wasn't brought in because he was a perfect fit for the project. He was brought in because he was a safe choice. And it helped that he was already managed by Ray Danniels, the same man running Van Halen. So after dealing with the massive clashing egos of David Lee Roth and Sammy Hagar, Eddie just wanted someone who would show up, sing the parts, and not push back. And Gary was agreeable. He was eager to please, but in rock and roll, sometimes that safe choice ends up being the most dangerous one you can make. And this brings us to the actual recording of the Van Halen III album, and the core reason why the album sounds the way it does. Since the early 1980s, Eddie Van Halen, he'd been steadily taking more and more control over the band's direction musically, and when he built his 5150 home studio back in the mid-80s, it gave him the freedom to record whenever he wanted. But it also created a kind of a creative bubble for him. So by the time 1997 rolled around, Eddie had total creative control. There was no Ted Templeman in the room to tell him a song was too long. There was no Don Landy there to push back on the mix. Eddie co-produced this album with Mike Post. Now, Mike Post was a guy famous for writing television theme songs like Law and Order, for instance, not for producing gritty hard rock records. So there you have it. You have a genius like Eddie Van Halen, and he has absolutely zero boundaries. And that doesn't help things. That hurts things because things get overcomplicated very quickly. Those songs on Van Halen 3 are dense. They drag on. The arrangements, they're all over the place. But the biggest issue, and this is something fans of my channel bring up all the time, was the shift away from the guitar. Eddie was experimenting heavily with keyboards and different types of textures. He even sang lead on the final track, How Many Say I, which is basically just Eddie crooning over a piano piece. And here's how deep the Eddie project thing really went. Longtime bassist Michael Anthony, whose bass and backing vocals were part of the band's DNA for 20 years, he only played bass on 3 of the album's songs. Eddie handled bass duties himself on everything else. And Mike has openly said that he felt like the record was more of an Eddie solo project than a band effort. People bought a Van Halen record expecting guitar fireworks, and instead they got an experimental, keyboard-heavy kind of art rock project. The spirit of the music, you know, the thing that we Van Halen fans love, that raw, dangerous energy that made the band famous, was completely buried under too many layers of production. The band didn't sound like a band playing in a room together. It sounded like Eddie Van Halen's solo project instead. Despite the confusing album, Van Halen, they still had to go out on the road and support it. And this is where the culture clash between Gary Cherone and the legacy of Van Halen became impossible to ignore. So let's look at the 2 frontmen who came before him. You have David Lee Roth, who was basically the carnival barker. He was the master of ceremonies. He had that arrogant, cool swagger. He was the guy that most guys wanted to be. And Sammy Hagar was the life of the party. He was the Cabo Wabo guy pouring you a shot of tequila at the backyard barbecue. Now, Gary Cherone, he was neither one of those things. His stage presence was incredibly theatrical. He was hyperactive, to put it mildly. He would strike a dramatic pose, he'd writhe around on stage and treat the performance like he was in a Broadway play. Now, one of the comments I saw in a previous video I made perfectly described Gary's vocal style on this tour. It sounded like he was stressing, like he was physically forcing the performance rather than just letting it flow. Vocally, Gary actually handled the older Roth catalog much better than Sammy ever did. He could actually hit those notes. But rock and roll isn't just just not about hitting the right notes on a sheet of music. It's about a vibe, and the vibe was entirely wrong. It was jarring for the fans to watch. It felt like watching a highly trained theater actor trying to play the role of a rock star, which I know doesn't sound fair, but that's what it was at the time. It just didn't feel natural, and the audiences, they felt that disconnect every single night. So when the dust settled and the tour wrapped up, the reality of the situation set in. Van Halen 3 barely went gold, so that's 500,000 copies. And in the music business, for a band of Van Halen's magnitude, that's considered a massive commercial failure. The fans rejected it, myself included. It's one of my most hated albums of all time. Radio stations ignored it. And here's the part that most people don't realize. The band didn't immediately give up on Gary. I mean, in early 1999, they went back into the 5150 studios to make a second album with him, and they got surprisingly far. They demoed 7 songs, and reportedly wrote more than 20 songs, this time with a real outside producer. They had Danny Korchmar, who came in, and he was brought in to take some of the control out of Eddie's hands. By several accounts, including Gary Cherone's own accounts, those demos were actually clicking better than the material on Van Halen III ever did, but it never got finished. By late 1999, the whole thing collapsed from the inside. Eddie's drinking and substance abuse crept back in. The mood in the camp turned dysfunctional, and in November of 1999, Gary Cherone amicably left the band. That second album with Cherone was shelved and to this day has never been officially released. And that's the real tragedy here. There was no dramatic label execution of the band or of Gary. There was no single villain. The engine just stopped. The failure of the album, combined with Eddie's escalating personal issues and health battles, sent the band into a tailspin. The momentum that had carried them through two wildly successful eras of singers, it was completely dead on arrival, or like that old song, DOA. It took 14 years, a disastrous 2004 reunion with Sammy, and eventually bringing back David Lee Roth into the fold in 2007 before they ever managed to get back into a studio and released a different kind of truth. Van Halen III isn't just a bad album. It's a cautionary tale. So this is what happens when management makes reactive decisions. When a brilliant musician, he isolates himself from constructive criticism, and when a band forgets what made people fall in love with them in the first place. So I want to know what you guys think. Were you around when this record dropped, and did you see the Gary Cherone tour? I did not. Let me know your experience in the comments below. And if you like this kind of sort of unvarnished rock history, please make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. And I highly recommend checking out my book, Near Miss, right there on Amazon. And the link for the book is in the description below. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.